So for the rest of this class, we're really going to be building methods that looks exactly like this. And I don't think this is like the best use of your time. So I'm going to go ahead and paste the code, and then we're going to walk through it. So I pasted the code in, and now we have all of those other functions. So I need to do some import, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So I imported everything just to get rid of all the errors, and let's go ahead and walk through the code. So the first one we already did in the last lecture. The second one is for back credential, and I just sent the bad request, and I sent the message for incorrect credential. Next one is access denied. Same thing for lacked exception, if the account is locked or if access is denied. Token expired, and this is coming from the actual auth 0. So that's the package. So this is not coming from Spring, it's coming from the package. So if they try to access the application with an unexpired token, then we will catch it with this exception. As you can see here, I'm getting the exception, and then I get the message from the exception. I don't think I need to do this here because I'm already doing it in this method. So I can just remove this. Okay, so this is that, and then email exists. I get the exception, get the message. The same for username exists, email not found, user not found. And this is an interesting one. So this is the HTTP request method not supported exception. So this is gonna fire, or this is gonna be thrown if the user tries to send a request and use the wrong request method. So if they're supposed to send a post request, but they send a get request, so this will be fired, and that's what I'm catching here, and I'm catching the exception here. Now, what I want you to see is this is a little bit different, than the other ones. I'm doing a little bit more work here. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to send a better message to the user. So in this exception, I have access to the supported method. So as you can see, if we go in there, actually, you see that if we scroll down, I have access to all the supported method, right? And this is what I want to send back to the user. As you can see here, we have supported methods here in this class. Okay, so I want to tell the user that this is the correct method that you have to use. Okay, and it's coming here as a simple HTTP method, which is, if you go into here, you can see it's an enum. So that's kind of a string in itself. So we can return it like this. Oops. So what I'm doing here is I'm making sure that this is not null. And you can see it's null, but we don't necessarily have to do this because I'm pretty sure it's not going to be null, but it's just like a safety thing. So I go into the exception, which is this exception right here, and then I get this supported methods, right? And that's going to return a set of HTTP method. And HTTP method is an enum, right? So it's going to return a set of HTTP method. So I know for sure that if they didn't send the correct HTTP method, it's gonna be only one other HTTP method that I need. So which is why I call the iterator, and I get next, which is gonna return, this is gonna return the first element in the set. And I'm pretty sure my set is always gonna have like one element, because all of my endpoints, they only accept one method like there. So this is always gonna be like the first one or whatever that is, and then I'm just gonna pass it in here. Now what I'm doing here with the string format, I pass the message in this supported method, which is gonna be an enum. If you look at this message right here, scroll to the right, you'll see that I have this symbol here. So when I pass in the string format with this message, it's gonna replace this with the actual message, and that's what I'm doing here. Okay, so I call the string format, and then I pass in this string, which I just showed you, and then I pass the method. So it's gonna take this method and put it inside the message and this at this location. Okay, so the message is gonna be read, this request method is not allowed on this endpoint, please send and it's gonna be like a post or get or whatever the supported method is, and then request. Okay, and you're gonna see that whenever we test this. So that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing here. And then all the other ones are the same. So here I'm catching exceptions. So if there is something that I'm not catching here, like a specific exception, it's gonna come here and see this exception and it's gonna throw it. So if it's any of those, it's gonna go through the appropriate function or method, right? So if it's like a user not found, it's gonna come here. If it's a no result exception, it's gonna come here. IO exception is gonna come here, you know. And if it's email not found, it's gonna come here. But if it's not any of this message of these exceptions, but it's just some other exception, then it's gonna come here, because you remember this is like the parent of all the exceptions. So we're still catching everything. Another thing I want to mention is some of those exceptions. For instance, I remember there was like this one. I didn't think to handle this exception. It just didn't come to my mind. And then, but I had this exception here. And one time there was an exception that was thrown, and I didn't know what the exception it was. So then this cut that exception. So I was like, oh, okay, then I'm just gonna specify this specific exception, because I know there's a possibility that it might be thrown. So that's why I have a logger for the regular exception. So I can log this exception, so I can look at the message and look at the class to see exactly what happened. And that's why I'm using the logger here. Here I just want to see what happens with the no result exception, which is going to come from Hibernate. So I just want to put this here for debugging purposes. Okay, and the same with the file, so I can know exactly what happens with the file. I get the message. So pretty much the same. You know, I just didn't want to just have this. You can have just this if you want, and that's pretty much going to catch everything. But you know, you're always going to send a 500, and that's not always good, because you have to be you know, as specific as possible. So that's why I have all these methods in there, and then try to handle every single one of those exceptions you know, in a very particular way, so that I don't send the same HTTP you know, response every single time for like different exceptions. So that's what this class is doing. So now anytime in the controller, in the resource, which is extending this exception or this class, anytime an exception happened from a request that was sent to this class, it's gonna look here and see if there is a handler, and it's gonna go to the particular handler and send the response to the user. As you can see, we're returning a response entity, right, of type HTTP response. So if it doesn't find a particular or that specific exception, like if it's a disabled exception or access denied, then it's gonna fall down to this exception. So we're always gonna catch whatever goes wrong in the application. So I hope that makes sense, and we'll continue in the next lecture.